The morning sun cast long shadows across Bagram Airfield as Captain Sarah "Thunder" Rodriguez walked toward her A-10 Thunderbolt II for what would be her final mission in the legendary aircraft. The twin-engine beast, affectionately known as the Warthog, had been her faithful companion through countless missions over Afghanistan. Its distinctive design, with engines mounted high on the fuselage and that massive GAU-8 cannon protruding from the nose, made it look more like a flying tank than a traditional fighter jet. Sarah had earned her call sign, Thunder, not from the roar of her engines, but from the devastating precision with which she delivered close air support to ground troops. Over 3 tours of duty, she had become something of a legend among the soldiers she protected. Her A-10, tail number 810964, was painted with small bomb symbols marking successful missions, but more importantly, it bore the names of ground units she had saved from impossible situations. The aircraft itself told stories that only she and her crew chief truly understood. Bullet holes had been patched and repainted so many times that the maintenance records read like a novel of near-death experiences. The right engine bore scorch marks from a surface-to-air missile that had detonated just close enough to singe the paint, but not close enough to bring her down. The landing gear had been reinforced twice after hard landings on makeshift airstrips, while providing emergency support to isolated outposts. What made Sarah exceptional wasn't just her flying ability, though she could thread the A-10 through mountain passes that would make seasoned pilots break into cold sweats. It was her ability to communicate with ground forces, to understand exactly what they needed, and to deliver it with surgical precision. She had mastered the art of low and slow flight, using the A-10's unique capabilities to provide sustained fire support that could turn the tide of a battle. Her reputation had spread beyond her squadron, beyond her base, and even beyond the Air Force itself. Army and Marine units specifically requested her call sign when they needed close air support. Other A-10 pilots studied her tactics and tried to replicate her success. She had turned the ungainly-looking Warthog into an extension of her own will, a precision instrument of protection for those fighting on the ground. But military careers, like all things, must eventually come to an end. The Air Force had been pushing to retire the A-10 fleet for years, claiming that newer, faster aircraft could perform the same missions. Sarah knew better. She understood that the A-10's ability to loiter over a battlefield, to take damage and keep flying, and to provide sustained firepower was irreplaceable. Still, orders were orders, and her time with the Warthog was coming to an end. As she completed her pre-flight inspection that morning, running her hands along the familiar surfaces and checking systems she could operate blindfolded, Sarah couldn't have known that this routine mission would become the stuff of military legend. The intelligence briefing had been standard. Provide overwatch for a convoy moving through a known trouble area. Be ready to respond to any threats that emerged. Just another day at the office for someone who had made a career of turning dangerous situations into successful outcomes. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Martinez, approached with the final maintenance sign-off. He had worked on Sarah's aircraft for 2 years and knew every rivet, every patch, every quirk of the machine. "She's ready to go, Captain," he said, though there was something different in his voice. "Fly safe out there." There was an unspoken understanding between them that this might be one of the last times they would go through this ritual together. Sarah climbed into the cockpit, settling into the familiar embrace of the ejection seat and beginning the startup sequence she had performed hundreds of times before. The twin turbofan engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, different from the roar of fighter jets but reassuring in its own way. As she taxied toward the runway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen, though she had no idea how right that premonition would prove to be. The mission started like any other routine patrol, but in Afghanistan, routine could turn deadly in seconds. Sarah was providing overwatch for a supply convoy threading its way through the narrow mountain passes of the Hindu Kush when her radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "Thunder, this is Groundhog 6. We've got multiple contacts moving toward our position. Looks like they're trying to set up an ambush." Sarah immediately banked her A-10 toward the convoy's location, her eyes scanning the rocky terrain below. Through her targeting pod, she could see the distinctive heat signatures of armed fighters moving into position along the ridgeline above the narrow road. The convoy was walking straight into a trap, and they wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. Groundhog 6, Thunder. I have visual on at least 12 hostiles on the North Ridge. They're carrying what looks like RPGs and heavy weapons. You need to stop your convoy now. Her voice was calm and professional, but inside, her heart was racing. She had seen this scenario play out before, and it rarely ended well for the ground forces caught in the kill zone. The convoy commander's response was immediate. Thunder, we can't stop here. We're in the narrowest part of the pass. If we get hit here, we're sitting ducks. Can you clear the ridge for us? The desperation in his voice was barely concealed. 24 soldiers in 6 vehicles, trapped in a canyon with nowhere to run. Sarah was already lining up her attack run, the A-10's nose dropping as she pushed the throttles forward. The GAU-8 cannon, capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute of 30mm depleted uranium shells, was her primary weapon, but she also carried a full load of rockets and precision-guided bombs. The key was to eliminate the threat without bringing the mountain down on the convoy below. Her first pass was textbook perfect. The cannon's distinctive brrr-t sound echoed off the canyon walls as she walked a line of destruction along the ridge, targeting the heavy weapons positions she had identified. Secondary explosions confirmed hits on ammunition stockpiles. But as she pulled up and circled for another pass, her aircraft shuddered violently. Warning, warning, hydraulic pressure loss, announced the automated voice in her headset. A quick glance at her instruments confirmed what she already feared. She had taken a hit from something, probably a lucky shot from a small arms fire or a fragment from one of the explosions she had caused. The A-10 was famous for its ability to survive damage, but losing hydraulics was serious. Groundhog 6, Thunder. I'm showing some system damage, but I'm still in the fight. How's your situation down there? She forced her voice to remain steady while running through emergency procedures in her head. The convoy was still trapped, and there were more hostiles moving into position. Thunder, you cleared most of the ridge, but we've got more contacts coming up the south side. They're trying to flank us. We need immediate support or we're not going to make it out of here. The convoy commander's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Without her continued support, those 24 soldiers would become casualties. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. Despite the warnings flashing on her instruments and the sluggish response of her flight controls, she began another attack run. The A-10 could fly with massive damage. She had heard stories of pilots bringing their aircraft home with entire sections shot away. But each pass increased the risk of catastrophic failure. The second attack run was even more aggressive than the first. Flying lower and slower than any sane pilot would attempt with a damaged aircraft, Sarah systematically eliminated the remaining threat positions. Her cannon fire was precise and devastating, but the effort cost her. More warning lights appeared on her instrument panel, and the aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Thunder, this is Groundhog 6. Threat neutralized. You saved our lives up there. We're moving out now, are you okay? The relief in the convoy commander's voice was obvious, but Sarah was too focused on keeping her damaged aircraft flying to respond immediately. As she struggled to maintain control, Sarah realized that her problems were just beginning. The hydraulic damage was worse than she had initially thought, and she was still hours away from base. The A-10 might be tough, but even the Warthog had its limits. What happened next would test both the aircraft's legendary durability and her own skills as a pilot in ways that neither had ever been tested before. The flight back to Bagram should have taken 45 minutes, but with her damaged hydraulic systems, Sarah was nursing her A-10 through the sky like a wounded bird. The aircraft was responding to her inputs, but everything felt wrong. The stick was heavy in her hands, requiring constant pressure to maintain level flight, and several backup systems had automatically engaged to compensate for the primary failures. Bagram Tower, Thunder 47, declaring emergency. I have multiple hydraulic failures and need priority landing clearance. Her radio call was professional and calm, but inside the cockpit, she was running through every emergency procedure she had ever learned. The A-10's manual reversion mode allowed her to fly without hydraulics, but landing would be a challenge that would test every skill she had developed over her career. Thunder 47, Bagram Tower. Emergency crews are standing by. Can you maintain current altitude and airspeed? The tower controller's voice carried the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled many emergency situations. But there was an underlying tension that suggested this was more serious than routine. Bagram. I'm maintaining altitude, but airspeed is fluctuating. The aircraft is controllable but requires constant inputs. Fuel is adequate for approach and one go-around if needed. Sarah was already mentally rehearsing the landing procedure, knowing that she would likely get only one chance to get it right. As she approached the airfield, word of her emergency had spread throughout the base. A-10 pilots were known for their ability to bring home damaged aircraft, and stories of successful emergency landings were part of squadron folklore. But as Sarah lined up for final approach, even experienced pilots on the ground were holding their breath. The landing was a masterclass in emergency flying techniques. Sarah compensated for the lack of hydraulic assistance by using manual reversion mode, essentially flying the aircraft through cables and pulleys rather than powered flight controls. The touchdown was firm but controlled, and she managed to keep the aircraft on the center line despite its tendency to pull to one side. As the A-10 rolled to a stop on the runway, emergency vehicles surrounded it immediately. Firefighters stood ready with foam cannons while medical personnel prepared for the worst. But Sarah shut down the engines normally, completed her emergency checklists, and climbed out of the cockpit under her own power. To the casual observer, it might have looked like just another successful mission. The post-flight inspection revealed the true extent of the damage. The aircraft had taken multiple hits from small arms fire and shrapnel. One round had severed a primary hydraulic line, while fragments had damaged secondary systems throughout the aircraft. The maintenance crew chief, Master Sergeant Martinez, shook his head as he examined the damage. Captain, I don't know how you kept this thing flying. By all rights, you should have lost control 20 minutes ago. But the real significance of this emergency landing wouldn't become apparent until the next morning. As Sarah was debriefing with her squadron commander, she received unexpected news. Rodriguez, I just got a call from Wing Headquarters. They want you to report to the commander's office at 0800 tomorrow. Something about a reassignment. The meeting with the wing commander was brief and to the point. Captain Rodriguez, due to the extent of damage to your aircraft and the current drawdown of A-10 operations in theater, you're being reassigned effective immediately. You'll be transitioning to F-16s at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona. Your orders are being cut today. Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. The A-10 wasn't just an aircraft to her, it was her identity, her purpose, her way of protecting the soldiers who depended on her. The F-16 was a fine aircraft, but it was a different mission entirely. Air-to-air combat and high-altitude bombing were a world away from the low and slow close air support that had defined her career. Sir, I understand the situation, but I'd like to request to stay with A-10s, even if it means a different assignment or a delay in rotation home. Her voice was steady, but the wing commander could see the disappointment in her eyes. I'm sorry, Captain, but the decision has already been made at levels well above my authority. The A-10 program is winding down, and we need experienced pilots, transitioning to other platforms. Your reputation and skills will serve you well in the F-16 community. The finality in his voice made it clear that there would be no appeal. As Sarah left the wing commander's office, she realized that her emergency landing had become something more significant. It was the end of an era. Her damaged A-10 would be sent to the boneyard, and she would be starting over in an entirely different aircraft. What she couldn't have known was that this transition would lead to encounters and revelations that would change everything she thought she knew about military aviation and her own place in its history. Luke Air Force Base in Arizona was a different world from the combat operations Sarah had known in Afghanistan. The sprawling training facility was home to F-16 training squadrons, where pilots from around the world came to learn to fly the Fighting Falcon. For Sarah, walking across the flight line filled with sleek single-engine fighters was like stepping into an alien landscape after years with the rugged twin-engine A-10. The F-16 transition program was intensive and demanding. Sarah found herself back in ground school, learning systems that were completely different from anything she had experienced. Where the A-10 was designed for durability and sustained firepower, The F-16 was built for speed, maneuverability, and versatility. The single-seat fighter could perform air-to-air combat, precision bombing, and wild weasel missions against enemy air defenses. Her instructor pilot, Major Viper Johnson, was a seasoned F-16 veteran with over 3,000 hours in the one Fighting Falcon. He had heard about Sarah's reputation in the A-10 community, but he made it clear from the beginning that her previous experience, while valuable, wouldn't make the transition automatic. The F-16 is a different beast entirely, he explained, during their first briefing. Everything happens faster, higher, and at greater distances. Forget everything you know about slow and low. The first few training flights were humbling experiences for someone who had been considered an expert in her previous aircraft. The F-16's fly-by-wire flight control system felt alien after years of direct mechanical linkages in the A-10. The aircraft was so sensitive that her initial attempts at formation flying looked more like aerial ballet performed by someone with no rhythm. Every input had to be relearned, every procedure memorized anew. But Sarah was nothing if not determined. She threw herself into the training with the same intensity that had made her legendary in the A-10 community. She spent hours in the simulator, practicing procedures until they became second nature. She studied technical manuals until she could recite systems specifications from memory. Slowly, gradually, she began to feel comfortable in the F-16's cockpit. The breakthrough came during her 10th training flight, when Major Johnson challenged her to a simulated air-to-air engagement. Sarah's A-10 background had given her an understanding of three-dimensional thinking and threat assessment that translated surprisingly well to fighter tactics. When the engagement began, she found herself thinking several moves ahead, anticipating her opponent's actions and positioning herself for advantage. Thunder, where did that come from? Major Johnson asked over the radio after she had successfully defeated his simulated attack. That was some serious tactical thinking for someone new to the F-16. His surprise was genuine. Most A-10 pilots struggled with the transition to air-to-air combat, but Sarah seemed to have an intuitive grasp of fighter tactics. Word of her, rapid progress spread through the squadron, and soon she was flying with different instructor pilots who wanted to see what the former Warthog driver could do. Each flight revealed new aspects of her abilities, and it became clear that Sarah wasn't just adapting to the F-16. She was excelling in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. The social dynamics at Luke were different from her previous assignments as well. The F-16 community had its own culture, its own traditions, and its own way of measuring pilot worth. Combat experience was respected, but performance in the F-16 was what really mattered. Sarah found herself starting over not just technically but socially, proving herself all over again to a new community of aviators. During her off-duty hours, she often found herself walking the flight line in the evening, looking at the rows of F-16s and thinking about her old A-10 sitting in the boneyard. The transition was more than just learning new aircraft systems. It was rebuilding her entire identity as a pilot. She had gone from being Thunder, the legendary close air support pilot, to being just another student learning to fly fighters. But late at night, when she reviewed her training progress and looked ahead to the advanced phases of the program, Sarah began to sense that this transition might lead to opportunities she had never imagined. The skills she was developing in the F-16 were opening doors to missions and capabilities that went far beyond anything she had experienced in the A-10 world. Little did she know that those new capabilities would soon put her in situations where her past and present would collide in ways that would shock even the most experienced pilots in the F-16 community. 3 months into her F-16 training at Luke, Sarah had progressed to advanced tactical formations and cross-country navigation flights. She was no longer the struggling A-10 pilot trying to adapt to a new aircraft. She had become a competent F-16 pilot with skills that impressed even veteran instructors. Her call sign had evolved from Thunder to Storm, reflecting both her weather-related theme and her increasingly formidable presence in the fighter community. The day that would change everything started as a routine training mission. Sarah was leading a 4-ship formation on a cross-country navigation exercise to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. The other 3 pilots in her formation were also experienced aviators transitioning from other aircraft types, one from F-15. Eagles, one from F-18 Super Hornets and one from F-22 Raptors. They were an elite group, representing the best pilots from their respective communities. As they flew over the Arizona desert, the formation was picture-perfect. Sarah had developed an eye for precision that served her well in the demanding world of fighter aviation. Her radio calls were crisp and professional, her formation positioning was exact, and her navigation was flawless. To any observer, she looked like a pilot who had been flying F-16s her entire career. But unknown to Sarah, her formation was being monitored by a special observer at Nellis. Colonel Hawk Stevens was a legendary test pilot and former Thunderbird demonstration team leader who was evaluating candidates for a classified program. He had been watching the approaching formation on radar and through high-powered binoculars, assessing the quality of their flying and formation discipline. When Sarah's formation checked in with Nellis approach control, something in her radio transmissions caught Colonel Stevens' attention. Her voice had a quality, a combination of confidence and humility, that reminded him of something from his past. He made a note to observe their landing and ground operations more closely. The landing at Nellis was executed with the same precision as their flight. Sarah led the formation through a tactical approach and landing that demonstrated advanced pilot skills. As the 4 F-16s taxied to the transient aircraft parking area, Colonel Stevens was already walking toward the flight line, his interest piqued by what he had observed. During the routine post-flight procedures, Colonel Stevens approached Sarah's aircraft as she was completing her shutdown checklist. "Excuse me, Captain," he called out as she climbed down from the cockpit. "I was watching your formation work today. Very impressive flying. What's your background?" Sarah snapped to attention when she recognized the colonel's rank and the distinctive test pilot wings on his flight suit. "Thank you, sir. Captain Sarah Rodriguez. I'm currently transitioning to F-16s from A-10s. This is my 15th flight in the F-16. Colonel Stevens' eyebrows rose slightly. 15 flights was barely enough to solo in the F-16, much less lead tactical formations with such precision. A-10s? What was your tail number over in Afghanistan? The question seemed casual, but there was an intensity in his eyes that suggested it was anything but routine. Sir, I flew several different aircraft, but my primary bird was 810964. Had that one for most of my last deployment. Sarah answered without thinking, wondering why a test pilot at Nellis would care about A-10 tail numbers from Afghanistan. The effect of her answer on Colonel Stevens was immediate and dramatic. His casual demeanor vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like reverence. He stood silently for several long seconds, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. The other pilots in her formation had stopped their own post-flight activities, sensing that something significant was happening. "Captain Rodriguez," Colonel Stevens said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "Do you have any idea what that tail number represents in certain circles?" His question was delivered with the gravity of someone about to reveal a profound truth. Sarah was confused by the sudden change in the colonel's attitude. "Sir, it was just my assigned aircraft. A standard A-10A that had been in service since the early 80s. Nothing special about it that I knew of." She was genuinely puzzled by the colonel's reaction and the attention her simple answer had generated. Colonel Stevens looked around at the other pilots who had gathered nearby, drawn by the unusual nature of the conversation. "Gentlemen, you're standing in the presence of someone whose reputation in certain communities borders on legendary. Captain Rodriguez, that standard A-10 you flew has a history that goes back to some of the most classified and dangerous missions ever flown by the United States Air Force." The silence that followed was profound. Sarah felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She had flown 810964 for years, treating it as just another aircraft in the squadron inventory. The idea that it had some special significance beyond her own missions had never occurred to her. But looking at the faces around her, experienced pilots who had suddenly begun looking at her with new respect and curiosity, she realized that her career was about to take another unexpected turn. Colonel Stevens gestured for Sarah to follow him away from the curious ears of the other pilots. They walked to a quiet corner of the flight line where their conversation couldn't be overheard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Nevada desert as one of the most extraordinary briefings in military aviation history was about to begin. Captain Rodriguez, what I'm about to tell you is not classified, but it's not widely known either. Tail number 810964 isn't just any A-10. It's the same aircraft that was flown by Colonel Maria Santos during Operation Gothic Serpent in Somalia in 1993. Colonel Stevens paused, letting that information sink in. Colonel Santos was the first female pilot to receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for valor in combat. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process this information. She had heard of Colonel Santos, of course. Every female military aviator knew the story of the pioneering A-10 pilot who had broken barriers and set standards that others still aspired to meet. But the connection to her own aircraft had never been mentioned in any of the maintenance records or squadron histories she had access to. But that's not the end of the story, Colonel Stevens continued. After Somalia, 810964 was flown by Captain James Iron Man Mitchell during the early phases of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Mitchell used that aircraft to perform some of the most daring close air support missions of the entire war, including the famous rescue of the 507th Maintenance Company near An-Nasiriyah. The pieces were starting to fall into place for Sarah. The mysterious battle damage repairs she had noticed, the reinforced landing gear, the engine modifications that seemed to go beyond standard upgrades. All of these now made sense. Her A-10 hadn't just been a combat aircraft, it had been the mount of legends. Colonel, why wasn't any of this in the aircraft records? Why didn't anyone tell me about this history? Sarah's question reflected both amazement and a touch of frustration that such significant information had been kept from her. Colonel Stevens smiled, but it was a serious expression that carried decades of military experience. Because, Captain Rodriguez, the Air Force has learned that when pilots know they're flying a legendary aircraft, they sometimes try too hard to live up to that legacy. We've found that the best pilots like you, create their own legends without knowing about the ones that came before. He reached into his flight suit pocket and pulled out a photograph that looked like it had been carried for years. It showed a young woman standing next to an A-10, her face bearing a confident smile that Sarah recognized from mirrors and photographs of herself. This is Colonel Santos next to your aircraft in 1993. She went on to become a test pilot and eventually commanded her own wing. Captain Mitchell, who flew it after her, is now a brigadier general. Sarah studied the photograph, seeing not just the historical significance but the continuity of service that connected her to pilots who had come before. Sir, what does this mean for my current assignment? Why are you telling me this now? Because, Captain Rodriguez, your performance in that aircraft and your transition performance in the F-16 have caught the attention of some very senior people. There's a program, one that I can't discuss in detail here, that needs pilots with your unique combination of skills, combat experience, adaptability, precision under pressure, and the ability to master multiple aircraft types. Colonel Stevens paused and looked directly into Sarah's eyes. The question is whether you're interested in continuing the legacy that began with that tail number, or whether you're content to be just another F-16 pilot in the normal progression of assignments. The weight of the decision was immediately apparent to Sarah. Her career had already taken unexpected turns, from A-10 pilot to F-16 trainee, and now she was being offered another path entirely. But something in Colonel Stevens's manner suggested that this wasn't just another assignment opportunity. It was a chance to be part of something significant. Sir, what exactly are you asking me to consider? Sarah's question was direct, reflecting her military training and her desire to understand exactly what she was being offered. I'm asking you to consider joining a program where the aircraft you fly, the missions you perform, and the legacy you create will be limited only by your abilities and your courage. Your tail number, 810964, is being retired, but the tradition of excellence it represents doesn't have to end. Colonel Stevens extended his hand. The choice is yours, Captain Rodriguez, but I believe you already know what Colonel Santos and General Mitchell would tell you to do. As Sarah shook his hand, she realized that her emergency landing in Afghanistan hadn't been the end of her story with legendary aircraft. It had been the beginning of something far more significant. The grounding of her A-10 had led to a revelation that would reshape not just her career, but her understanding of her place in the continuing story of military aviation excellence. The silence of those F-16 pilots when they learned about her tail number wasn't just respect. It was recognition that they were in the presence of someone who had unknowingly been carrying on a tradition of heroism that stretched back through decades of American military history.